everyone, my name is Felicia and it is my honour to welcome you to this video presentation as part of RightFest 2020. I would like to, before we start, acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians upon the land of which we are hosting this event today and pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging. I'm sure many of you are already library members, but for those who aren't, it is free to join and it gives you access to a wide range of online and physical content. You can also sign up to our free e-newsletter to stay up to date on all the latest book releases and events such as the one you are watching today. Today we are listening to the amazing Barbara Hannay. Barbara Hannay writes women's fiction with over 12 million books sold worldwide. Her novels set in Australia have been translated into an amazing 26 languages, and she has won the Romance Writers of America's RITA Award, as well as being shortlisted 5 times. 2 of Barbara's novels have also won the Romance Writers of Australia's Romantic Book of the Year Award. So stay tuned for this exciting talk with author Barbara Hannay as she discusses her writing journey and her new book.
Hello, it's Barbara Hannay here, talking to you from Townsville in North Queensland, where we're currently enjoying a rather lovely sunny winter, which a feature of this part of the world, of course. And I'm very excited to be talking to people from libraries all over Australia and to talk about my new book, The Sister's Gift, released on August the 4th. Libraries have always been a very important part of my life, so that's why I particularly love talking to library goers. I grew up in Brisbane. So the very first library that I ever went to was the Red Hill Library on Enoggera Terrace in Brisbane. My family didn't have a car, so we had to catch the bus, which added to the excitement for me. And it was a small red brick building up there that I still remember and smile at when we drive past. I can't remember the very first book that I borrowed, but I do remember some of those early books because until then I'd had a rather quiet little suburban life, and books opened me to so many extra experiences. I remember one book that I particularly loved was about a girl whose family lived above the shop that they owned, and I thought that sounded incredibly interesting and romantic. And then there was a series of books about twins who lived all over the world. There was the Eskimo twins, the Japanese twins, the Dutch twins. And for a young girl who'd only known Brisbane to suddenly find out about all these different countries was really exciting for me. Another book I remember from that period was Heidi Again. And I think it was the setting that especially appealed up there in the Swiss Alps. And her grandfather's chalet and that little bunk bed that he'd made for her to sleep in, or that's how I remember it anyhow. And of course that was before I discovered Enid Blyton and reading became an absolute compulsion. While I was enjoying books to read, I also couldn't help myself to want to start making up my own stories. I remember I used to sit my sisters down in front of an orange box and I'd draw pictures on a piece of paper or several pieces of paper, which I'd then slide through the slats in the orange box. And this was movies that they were supposed to watch, poor things. I joined the Brownies, and the first proficiency badge that I wanted to earn was the Writer's Badge, which caused some consternation for my brown owl because no one had ever wanted to do that before, and she had to go and find a tester. But we got through that. Interestingly for me, in later years, looking back, I realised that story was about a girl whose family are transferred to the outback. And she's really worried because there'll be no brownie pack out in the outback, and how's she going to cope? And then she discovers the Lone Brownies Association. Little did I know that 40 or something years later, I'd be writing books set in the Australian outback. So yeah, while I loved writing and reading, I never ever dreamed of becoming an author. English was my favourite subject at school. I thought about becoming a lawyer after I read To Kill a Mockingbird in my senior year. I was absolutely inspired by Atticus. My dad talked to the men at work, and no, law wasn't a suitable career for a woman. This is in the 60s. I also thought about becoming a journalist because I loved reading the Courier Mail. Again, Dad spoke up and said, no, journalists spend all their time in pubs. I wouldn't like you to do that. And interestingly enough, I met a journalist several years later, fell in love with him and married him, and my dad was right. Journalists did in those days have to spend quite a bit of time in pubs because that's where the stories were, because that's where the police hung out. So, obedient daughter that I was, I became an English teacher instead. And for the next 20 years or so, I really enjoyed sharing my love of books and reading and writing with my students. And the idea of writing still lingered in the background for myself. I wrote some short stories for Women's Weekly and things like that. I wrote some books for my children, which they illustrated. One that we still have, a story about a princess in pink, which was about a princess who was fascinated by the colour pink, but then she went through several colours, and believe it or not, ended up with a rainbow prince. This is my son drawing this one. I don't think I'd go with that option if I wrote that story for kids these days, but yeah. So that was the sort of thing I used to do. Again, never really expecting to become an author until my late 40s, when my own children were starting to finish school themselves and look into interesting, exciting careers, and that's when I revisited my interest in writing and started to pursue it. So then I was first picked up as an author by Harlequin, Mills and Boon back in 1998. Hard to believe it was so long ago now, actually. Sorry, I'm just turning something on here. I did have a stopwatch going so I could see how long I was talking for, but I've lost that. Anyhow, it's okay. Oh, there's one on my screen, so I'm saved. Sorry about that. Yeah, I had a phone call from London from an editor in Mills and Boon back in 1998, and that was the beginning of my career as an author. I can't quite believe it's more than 20 years now that I've been writing novels. I wrote more than 40 novels for Harlequin, Mills and Boon, and most of them were set in the Australian outback, mostly here in North Queensland. My husband and our kids and I spent a lot of our holidays camping and canoeing on the Burdekin River and on a cattle property called Burdekin Downs out near Charters Towers. And the homestead there, beautiful rambling old homestead, has probably become the inspiration for many of the homesteads that I've written about ever since. And it certainly seemed that at that point, at any rate, outback Australia had a very exotic appeal for overseas readers, and they were very happy for me to write these stories, which I did so for quite a long time. But then in more recent years, I've expanded my horizons, and I've been writing for Penguin Australia as well. The Sister's Gift is actually the 9th book that I've written for Penguin Australia. And some of these books contain, as well as a contemporary rural story, a story set in World War II. So there's Moonlight Plains, which is set mostly in Townsville because World War II did come to Townsville, as many Australians weren't aware. The Secret Years, which has a World War II setting in the Blitz in London as well as the jungles of New Guinea, and it was a book that I absolutely loved doing the research for that. The Grazier's Wife, part of a trilogy of books set around a cattle property on the Atherton tablelands, and the World War II aspect of that was a nurse in Singapore, just at the fall of Singapore during the war. The Country Wedding, another one in that series, has a not actually World War II, more 1920s, 30s Shanghai, when the British many British people were living there, and many people from Europe actually. It was called the Paris of the East at the time. White Russian refugees, absolutely fascinating community. So I went to Shanghai and had a wonderful time researching for that book. And then just last year, I published Meet Me in Venice, where I went totally offshore, a contemporary story set entirely in Italy. So I've had a little bit of fun with my settings, which have remained important to me. But this year, with The Sister's Gift, the story is set on Magnetic Island, which is just 20 minutes ferry ride away from here in Townsville. We call Magnetic Island affectionately Maggie up this way. So, we might say, I'm going over to Maggie for the weekend, and everyone knows what we're talking about. And this story, I pitched the idea for this story to my editor at the same time as Meet Me in Venice, when I had to put forward two ideas for the next contract arrangement. And at the time, I wanted to write about a woman who was in her midlife, but where everything was going wrong for her. Her marriage had broken down. She'd lost her marriage, her job, and tragically her home. And she really is at rock bottom and has to start all over again. And at the time, I thought I was going to have her go away and live in some little hut in the hills or somewhere, and meet a young woman and form a friendship and go from there. That story was ticking away in the back of my mind all the time I was writing Meet Me from Venice. And at some point I thought I need a stronger emotional impact for it, and I started to play around with the idea of surrogacy. I thought perhaps this woman had had a surrogate baby when she was young, and now she's got nothing going right with her life, and she's remembering that, and she wants to find that baby, who's now a young woman. And perhaps they're overseas. I was thinking more of another exotic setting. And then at some point further on, as happens with writers, I decided, no, I want this to be all in the family. Family connections, they're always so complex, and the emotional depth that you can get to in families is really strong. So that's when I came up with the idea that she had the baby for her sister, and that there'd be emotional ramifications from that. Before I talk any more about it, I'd like to read you an extract from this book. And it's from the prologue, which pretty much sets up the situation that the rest of the book hangs on. So the prologue starts, "On the morning Freya went into labour, she told no one. She simply walked onto the Magnetic Island ferry, found a padded seat near an open window, and focused on the seagulls lined along the jetty." I go on to describe a bit more about her journey across to the mainland on the ferry, in labour and all the rest of it. But she happily does make it to the hospital all in one piece. And I'll just read the second half of the prologue then. "A mere 3 hours later, Freya made the necessary phone call. 'Pearl, she's here.' 'What? Who's there?' 'The baby. She's arrived.' 'Oh my God, how?' 'She's so cute. I think she looks a lot like Troy.' 'Freya!' Pearl's voice was frantic. 'Why didn't you tell me? You knew I wanted to be there. Troy's on night shift this week. He could have come too. We both wanted to be there. You knew that.' 'Sorry.' Freya looked down at the bundle of miniature perfection in her arms, reliving the enormous sense of achievement and excitement that had overridden the pain when this little girl slipped sweetly into the world with only a minimum of assistance from the midwife. It was all a bit of a rush. But we had everything planned. We told you so many times that we wanted to be there for the birth. Pearl's voice was sorrowful, accusing. Almost certainly she was crying, but Freya refused to feel guilty. She's here safely, Pearl. That's the main thing. I suppose. The sister's voice squeaked, and then, sounding more like her usual bossy self, have you expressed colostrum? Not yet, but I will. It's very important, as you know. Freya could imagine Pearl's stern frown now, the earnest expression in her pale blue eyes that could make her look years older than she was. Troy and I will be on the next ferry. Lovely. You won't actually breastfeed, will you? No, Pearl. I'll stick to our agreement. Right. Yes. Good. Of course you will. I promise, Pearl. After a beat. She's yours. Well, yes, of course she is. Freya let out her breath slowly. She hadn't wanted to make trouble today. True, she hadn't obeyed the rules she'd set out, but she was sure she'd earned this treasured window of time alone with the small creature she'd carried for so many months. She looked down at the baby's sweet pink perfection. Her skin was so soft, her tiny, tiny fingers and diminutive ears so exquisitely faultless. The baby screwed up her face, and love swelled in Freya to the point of bursting. It's over to you now, Pearl, she said bravely. To you and Troy. Thank you. There was no mistaking the relief in her sister's voice. Unfortunately, that relief wasn't particularly long-lasting. Pearl did remain insecure about the whole surrogacy situation. I'm envisaging back in 24 years ago when surrogacy wasn't even legal in Queensland, and Freya, Pearl and Troy had to go to Canberra for this procedure. I'm using a bit of poetic license perhaps, but I'm imagining that there was very little counselling for families undergoing surrogacy. So the sisters unfortunately didn't ever quite heal that little rift that started then. Pearl never tells her baby, who she calls Belinda, but who decides in her rebellious teenage years she wants to be called Billy. She never tells her about the surrogacy, so that secret is there between the family. I believe she was scared that Billy might love Freya more, too much, not, and her own mum not enough, because of some basic insecurities from their childhood, etc., which, we all know can happen in families. So when Freya is at rock bottom and needs her family's help, and they end up having to come together, all these tensions are there. So the rest of the book is set 24 years later, as I said, on Magnetic Island. So that's a very small space. There's only 2,500 people, or less than that, I think, who live on the island, and there's lots of little villages on the bays that around the island, and they're all separated by headlands. So it's like tiny little country towns, really. So it's a fraught kind of environment for keeping secrets, because we all know country towns and gossip and secrets are right pickings for writers. So I had that scenario as well. But it's really about a story of, I've got at the start of the book as my sort of quote that became a bit of a theme for me: new beginnings are often disguised as painful endings. So, this painful start or ending of one part of Freya's life and the new beginning is what's in store for her, perhaps, if she can sort out some of the issues. And, of course, any readers who know my books know that there are a couple of romantic heroes lurking in the background of this story as well. It's a story of second chances. Billy has her own issues that she has to deal with because she's just come back from overseas adventures and has her own secret. And even Pearl is nursing a situation that she's not prepared to talk about and doesn't come out until quite late in the story, when there's rather a dramatic coming together of all their issues. So it's a story that I had a lot of fun writing. I wrote it actually last year while we were moving back from the Atherton Tablelands up behind Cairns, where we had lived for over 10 years, and coming back here to Townsville. And that was a period of upheaval for me personally, saying goodbye to wonderful friends and to our lovely place there, but feeling it was time to come back to be sensible in our old age, and closer to our family, which we wanted, and we're very grateful for this year as things have turned out. But throughout that, I was a bit scared that the story I'd have trouble finding the story in the midst of all the things that were going on. But every time I sat down at the computer, Freya and Billy came and chatted to me, and on we went. So I was very grateful for that, and I really enjoyed writing the story, and I hope you people enjoy reading it. And I love hearing from readers. You can find me on Facebook or on my website, barbarahannay.com. And yeah, please feel very free to make contact at any point. Thank you. Bye.